22. This time we'll jump into committee reports. Can we get the homeless task force, Counselor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a homeless task force meeting yesterday. I think we're getting to the point in our work now. We've had a lot of learning, a lot of different community programs come and share information with us. Yesterday, the task force received a draft of some potential recommendations that they might bring back to this body and to the mayor. Over the next couple of weeks, the task force will be reviewing those, editing them, adding to them, subtracting from them, et cetera. And then we meet again on October 24th. So I would expect this group to start seeing some more specific things to think about and add feedback on after that October 24th meeting. It might not be in a formal setting, but just starting to see some specific things that you're going to want to pay attention to, I believe.
Thank you. We have council remarks. Councilor Bronco.
I just wanted to jump in. I've heard from a lot of constituents and community leaders. The Homeless Task Force has really been doing some good work. They've got some great ideas on the table. In particular, I've heard positive feedback about the street team's idea. So I want to congratulate Rich and thank him for addressing a very difficult but important issue.
Okay. Other council remarks? Seeing none, we're going to jump right into the most exciting presentation of the day by Sean Pritchard, Ovations and ASM Global Management Agreement Renewal.
And you're saying that not just because it's the only presentation of today, correct? I was going to lead with who doesn't love a good presentation on contracts. So, so we'll be talking about two agreements today, two management agreements, both related to the event center complex. One is for ASM Global, the other is for Ovations. As required by ordinance, and because they are management agreements, they are being brought forward at an informational 1 week prior to final consideration by the council here, which is scheduled to occur on October 11th. So with that, I am going to go ahead and jump in. I will say I'm going to talk about the ASM Global agreement first, and then I'm going to pause for questions that you might have related to that agreement, and then we'll move on to the Ovations agreement after that. And before I go too much farther, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank a couple of my team members who were highly engaged and involved in this negotiation with these agreements, those being Scott Rust, who is our purchasing manager with the City of Sioux Falls, and Tom Huber, who is our Assistant Director of Finance. So just getting right into it on the ASM Global agreement. So a little bit of history with ASM Global. ASM Global, who you might have referred to as SMG, a couple of years ago, they merged with AEG and became ASM Global Arena Management, LLC. They have been on board with us. Actually, we've had different periods of time with ASM, SMG in the past, but they've been continuously on board with us since we opened the Event Center back in 2014. They do oversee and provide facility management services for all operations, maintenance, and bookings for the Event Center campus, which includes the Arena Convention Center and the Premier Center. Our last agreement was a 5-year agreement, and that was executed beginning at January 1st, 2018, concludes at the end of this year. There was an extension provision within that agreement, which allows us to enter into a second 5-year agreement with them at this time. I would note there is no extension within this agreement. We would have to RFP at the completion of the next agreement if approved, which would end on December 31st, 2027. I also want to note, and we'll talk about this one separately, the Spectra or Ovations, who are our food and beverage operators. So we have sort of a unique structure here in Sioux Falls relative to other facilities across the nation, in that we have two different operators, one that does the facility management, which is ASM Global, and then Ovations, which is part of the OVG group that provides food and beverage operations. So while finance oversees essentially both of these as contract administrator, we do assert our contractor administrator responsibilities relative to the food and beverage operator contract to ASM Global as the facilities manager. We added maintenance to the Sioux Falls Stadium, or facility management of the Sioux Falls Stadium in 2018 as part of ASM Global's agreement, and that is still included as part of this proposed renewed agreement. And then we did remove the management of the Orpheum Theater in 2019, so ASM Global and both Ovations provided services at the Orpheum, and in 2019 that was turned over to the Washington Pavilion. A few highlights here from the operation of these various facilities over the last several years, or since the opening of the Premier Center, is that we've had over $98 million in revenues at all of the combined facilities. This does not include ticket sales, but just direct revenues that are reported by ASM Global. That resulted in over $5 million in net profits since inception, That included the losses that we've taken as a result of the pandemic when the facility was fully closed for 2.5 months, and of course, the issues with scheduling that occurred thereafter. We currently have a net equity position of about $5.5 million. Had attendance exceeding $6 million, $3.4 million of that was at the Premier Center. We've held over 6,000 events since 2014, 875 at the Premier Center. And the Premier Center is currently ranked number 67 in the nation, which is slightly higher post-COVID, primarily because we came online faster than many other facilities across the nation. You can compare that to the size of our community. We're about 131st largest community in the city, or excuse me, in the nation. And of course, several cities have several of these type of facilities located in them. So being ranked at that 67 range is something that I think our community can take pride in. I would say that our relationship with both of these, I could say this for both Spectra Ovations as well as ASM Global, we have had good overall coordination and relationship and communication with all of them. Great coordination amongst the three parties. And we've been very happy with the performance in terms of managing the building as well as the overall maintenance of the building and taking care of that asset. We've seen good revenue growth over the last several years, and as well as management of the expenses of those facilities. Just to give you a little bit of a highlight of the history of the profitability and gross revenues for this would be the Event Center campus. Before COVID, so 2019 and prior, we were averaging about $13 million annually in gross revenues. We had a record in 2019 at $14.2 million, and 2020 looked like it was going to be an even better year for us when, of course, the pandemic hit and the results that happened as a result of that. We averaged about $1.3 million in net profits from that period of 2015 to 2019, with 2019 being the record year in terms of profitability, in addition to gross revenues. So we had profits of about $1.7 million. You can see that we took that hit in 2020 due to the pandemic, where we lost $2.3 million. We started coming back again in 2021, where we saw about $800,000 in revenue. Through June, you can see on here, we were at about $1.8 million. We do expect, I think right now we're budgeting about, anticipating about 1.7-ish million, probably once we hit the end of the year. But we'll kind of see how the last several months of the year go, which September, October, November, December tend to be very busy months, particularly for the Premier Center. Revenues that we receive at the campus in excess of the operating expenses. It's important to note that these are retained in the operating account, which is withheld by ASM Global, but it's held on behalf of the city. This provides for cash flow, reserves, and future improvements, those reserves being critically important during the pandemic when we needed to absorb that $2.3 million loss. You can see our ending net equity position here. We started in 2015 with a $1.4 million at the end of the year, and that it grew to $5.2 million by the end of 2019. You can see the impact of COVID in 2020, bringing that down to $2.9 million. And we're hoping to see our net equity position back up to where it was pre-COVID by the end of this year as we continue to rebound overall at this complex. So first thing, in terms of this agreement, I'm going to just speak to some of the non-economic changes. We did have a restructuring of our compensation within that management agreement, so I'm going to talk pretty extensively about that and the whys for the restructuring. So I want to just talk about some of the non-economic impacts. Obviously, we updated the name from SMG to ASM Global. We removed any references to the Orpheum Theater since they no longer manage that facility. We had, in the previous agreement, provisions related to if we ceased operations either at the arena or the Orpheum. Obviously, the Orpheum is not applicable in this case with this agreement any longer, but we did add the stadium to that. We increased the responsibility of R&M from $2,500 per item to $5,000 per item. So this essentially means that if the cost of the repair and maintenance is under $5,000, now it will be covered through our operating accounts that are held by ASM Global. Anything above that, we would continue to use the entertainment tax and would go directly through the city to provide. We allowed for administrative approvals by email. We've been doing that in practice, just updating the agreement to make sure that that was defined within the agreement itself. In the past, they had made some capital contributions as part of the agreement. We were at a point where we didn't believe that that was probably making a major impact. We've been fortunate to have a strong entertainment tax base, and the city is primarily responsible for a lot of those large capital items anyway. And then we updated the insurance provision, the provision which has come up in various internal audits. There was a requirement that they had to provide us a certificate of insurance 45 days prior to the expiration of their current policy. Those who deal with insurance markets, particularly those that are dealing with insurance markets or insuring properties across the nation, which many of these corporations and management entities are, would know that that's a very difficult thing to achieve. And so we decreased that to a 15-day prior to the end of the insurance policy requirement, with the opportunity to reduce that by city administrative approval. So if they're moving toward it, but they haven't secured the insurance coverage yet, we can provide permission up to 1 day prior to the insurance certificate, but no later than the date of expiration of the policy. This same provision was built into the Ovations Agreement as well. So speaking of what was the prior compensation structure and how was that provided? So we had two pieces essentially of the structure. There was what we call the base fee, which is kind of your fixed fee that we were paying for management of the facilities, and then we had incentive fees, which were driven primarily by revenues, and there was a qualitative factor involved in that as well. So the base fee in the previous agreement started at $130,000 in 2018 and grew to $140,800 in 2022. That was based on a 2% escalator that was built into the agreement. Then, in addition to that, there were incentive fees. So there was what we call a $25,000 qualitative fee, and this is a discretionary incentive fee that is determined by the city upon conclusion of the audit for the year following the year which we're issuing the fee or the qualitative fee for. So that could be up for $25,000, and we would take into account things that you can't normally just put into numbers. So how well are you taking care of the building? What are your customer satisfaction? What's the diversity of the shows that you're providing? Just overall, what was the quality of the management, we believe, of that? And then we could issue up to $25,000, which of course is paid out of their operating account, as all their fees are, but couldn't be paid without approval. And we have a group, internal staff. We have a council member that sits on that review group every year. We have a city council staff member that also sits on that group. Councilor Cole was nice enough to join us this year as part of our review of the 2021 year. The larger portion of the incentive fees are driven based on revenue performance. And so the way the previous agreement was structured is that you would establish what was called a benchmark. And so you would take, let's say we're looking at 2022. The benchmark for 2022 would be based on 3 items averaged together. We would take the last 2-year actual revenues, so we would take 2020 and 2021, and then we would take the revenues that were projected in the budget, we would average those out, and that would become the benchmark figure. So let's say that benchmark figure is $10 million. If they generated revenues in excess of $10 million in 2022, up to 105% of $10 million, ASM Global would be able to keep 10% of that additional revenue that they generated as a result of that. Then there was an additional provision that if you went between 105%, up to 105% or higher, then they would be able to retain 20% of the revenue that they generated. But there was a cap on this, which was 115% of that base fee. And so the maximum compensation that could be received varied from $279,500 in 2018 up to $302,720 in 2022. Now, what we've seen over the course of going through this is we had discussed changing off of this compensation structure. This structure worked great, especially in the early years of the event center, when you could expect growing revenues as you kind of grew into the building. However, we are now kind of at a period where you're going to see more stabilized growth, more incremental growth, that this wouldn't be as conducive from an incentivization or incentivizing package to promote that revenue growth or excellence in management. The second piece of this is that because it includes the budget as part of the benchmark, it does provide the incentive, not that this happened necessarily, but it incentivizes you to maybe lowball your budget for that year because you're trying to decrease that benchmark that you're trying to exceed in order to achieve those higher incentive fees. And so that becomes a little bit problematic as well. And so those are some of the things that we took into consideration as we looked at trying to develop a new compensation structure. A little bit of the history of what the fees that were paid. You can see in 2015 they were paid $207,000. That increased up to $285,000 in 2019. Now, I'll tell you the other unique thing about this is that, say, for example, in 2019, they achieved so much in their incentive fees based on revenue that the qualitative measure no longer mattered. We could have issued them 0 and they still would have maxed out their fee because they had made so much based on their incentives on the revenues. Then you have the pandemic hit, and you can see what happened to the incentives as they primarily went away. 2020, the it didn't qualify for any revenue incentive, just the qualitative measure, which was issued at $25,000 for that year. 2021, they're starting to build back up, but they still got 2019 in that benchmark, making it a struggle to achieve higher revenues again. So they didn't qualify for many revenue incentives there. Now in 2022, they're likely to max out their revenue based on the performance that we've had for this year, primarily because they're benchmarking against a pandemic year where we were closed for 2.5 months and a 2021, which was a rebuilding year. And so starting to make up for some of those lost revenues, incentives for those prior 2 years, but certainly did take a hit in 2020 and 2021. So what were our goals and objectives as a city as we were looking to renew this contract? I think it's important to understand what our objectives are so that we know what we're trying to negotiate toward. First of all, in our mind, show and entertainment diversification is top of mind. While we like our country acts, and they certainly bring us probably the most in terms of profitability and attendance, we also know that we have a number of residents in our community that are at different ages and have different things that they would like to see, and it is a facility that is meant for everyone. And so being able to have diverse types of shows, family shows, Disney on Ice, Globetrotters, some of those things that would appeal to kids, that might be appealing to young families, is important to us as well. Also, you want to have diverse type of music options and entertainment options, whether it's comedians, heavy metal, personally not my taste, but for some people it is. Pop is important, as well as classic rock. So that's really important to us. We also recognize that we rely very heavily in terms of being a profitable and successful facility on that we have very good sponsors for our facility, that we have a great title sponsor for our facility. We have all of our suites that are rented and utilized by businesses and others within the community, as well as club seat holders and loge holders. We're also making sure that we keep those individual patrons satisfied, because at the end of the day, they matter very significantly to whether we are profitable or not a profitable facility. And those type of businesses that invest in those type of amenities, they're doing so because they want to bring their employees there, they want to bring their clients there, and the reason for that is we need to provide some entertainment options that appeal across the broad spectrum. And so that is something that we keep top of mind as well. The second thing is it's important to utilize incentives to maximize revenue and net profit opportunities. Incentives is a really key piece of this agreement as we bring it forward. It's more heavily reliant on incentives. It's just a belief and a philosophy that people will behave in a way that they are incentivized to do so. This is why we use third-party management, because we are incentivizing profitability and maximization of the investments that the city has made. We want to ensure that our facilities are being well maintained, but at the next bullet point is not lost on us as well, and that is there is an importance of community benefit. Not everything is about profitability or revenue. There are things, particularly at the convention center, that we want to host that we may not be able to maximize the revenue on, but it is going to maximize community investment in terms of people coming to our community, visitors from outside of our community, getting to know Sioux Falls, but also visiting our restaurants, our retail economy, as well as utilizing our hospitality and lodging industry. And so those are very important as well, and we've added something to the agreement to help support that. We want management stability and continuity, because change is never great for a facility, and we want to make sure that if we're going in the right direction, that we continue that with that momentum. It was really important to us to rebound from the pandemic impacts and to be one of the first facilities in the nation to be able to do so. And we want to be responsive to the state of the industry. The industry has, in many degrees, changed in a post-COVID world. The type of acts that are touring, the amount of dates that they're doing, where they're routing, those are all things that we have to adapt to, and how do we continue to put ourselves toward the top of their list as a facility that they want to be able to locate it in. One of the things that we've done for a great deal of time, and I think Ovations and ASM Global are particularly strong about this, and what Sioux Falls is known for is its hospitality when touring acts come to our community, not just for the stars of the act, but the people behind the scenes, whether it's the people that are driving the trucks, unloading all the equipment and putting that in place. They do a great job of setting up special food bars and coffee bars and things of that nature, giving them special trinkets and gifts that are very specific to that make this a unique experience and a place that people want to come back to time and time again. Because that word spreads. It's a fairly, small, close-knit community, and that word spreads between people who book between facilities. And if it comes to the difference between us and another facility, we want to be at the top of the line based on the things that we're doing. So this is just in a nutshell what the revised compensation structure would look like for the ASM Global agreement. I'm going to go into these in more in depth here, but I'll just give you a quick summary. So we're going to reduce the base fee, which I said this year was $140,000. We're reducing that down to $75,000 per year to allow for the capacity to lean more intentionally into the incentive side. We are doubling the qualitative incentive fee from $25,000 to $50,000. As I said, we're going to lean more heavily on the revenue incentive side. We're going to provide an opportunity to make additional management fee revenue if you can meet really big stretch goals in terms of revenue and profit. We're going to add a reduction factor that we haven't had before, which would actually reduce the incentives if we're not meeting profitability. So we don't want to pay incentives at in lieu of making a profit as well. And so there's some kind of areas that we can give and take on those incentives. We've added a revenue credit option, which I'll explain here in terms of community benefit. And then we've added 3% escalators per year beginning in year 2. So again, as I noted, we're reducing the base fee in about half from $140,000. We'll start at $75,000 going into 2023. It still allows for some fixed revenue potential in terms of a management fee, and that is important. It certainly was important, as we've seen during the pandemic, to keep that, but as we lean toward those incentives, we did reduce that. We increased the qualitative incentive fee from $25,000 to $50,000. It hadn't been increased since we started working with ASM Global SMG back in 2014. And so this, we increased it to $50,000 because it's really important. Those qualitative factors can be just as important as the quantitative revenues that we're generating at the facility. So particularly as the event center gets into its 7th, 8th, 9th year of operation, we want to make sure that that facility is being maintained as a first-class facility, playing to make sure that we're investing in that, but we're taking care of the facility and the things that our taxpayers have invested in. We added another piece to this qualitative item, which we would call the earned piece of the qualitative. So there is an opportunity to make it less discretionary and automatically earned based on the idea that we want to promote diversification and attraction of top acts to our community. And so we built in this provision that essentially states, if you, in that year, book a concert or a comedian or one of those events that ranks in the top 30 based on Pollstar ratings. So Pollstar puts out this information throughout the semi-annually and at the end of the year, and they'll tell you what were the top revenue performing shows across the nation. Some of them include stadium shows, so we're not going to compete against stadium shows, but we're going to be able to try to compete against some of those events, ones that are happening in venues similar to ours. So how many of those did we actually book at the Premier Center in that given year? And if you do that, you can earn a portion of that qualitative fee. So the way we've established that is you will earn up to $10,000 of the qualitative fee for any non-country, so a pop or a classic rock act that you book at the facility. You can earn $5,000 for a country act that's in the top 30. And why the distinction between the difference is country acts, are naturally going to come here. They're important to us. They certainly create a lot of revenue for our community, and they are still the #1 thing that people would like to see at the Premier Center. But we also want diversity of those pop acts, those legendary historic rock acts as well, and so we want to promote that, incentivize bringing those into our facility, and we've done that through the qualitative incentive fee. We created a tiered system in terms of earning additional incentives, so we still retain an incentive based on revenue, but it starts at a tier, and as you get into different tiers, you can grow your revenues in the management fee based on that. So tier 1 is revenues from 10 to 12.5 million, the opportunity to earn 2.5% of that gross. Revenues between 12.5 to 15 million, the opportunity to earn 3% of that, and then above 15 million, the opportunity to earn 3.5% of that. And we have a maximum of a $350,000 fee that can be paid, so that equates to about $17.5 million in revenues. Now, to give you kind of a baseline, as I said, before the pandemic, we were hitting about $13 million in revenues every year. That's probably where we're probably scaling to, I would say, in 2022. Mike, you can give me a frown if you don't think that's accurate. So you can see that we're really kind of hitting into that tier 2. So tier 2 is a strong year, but it's not like a stretch goal year. So tier 1 is maybe not as quite of a year, but you're still getting some incentive. Tier 3 is where you're really stretching to reach those and the opportunities to make additional revenue, because we know that if they're making additional revenue, there's going to be more profits to the city. And what the profits will do is they will stay with the facility. It's an opportunity to maybe lay off some of the capital improvements to the operating account rather than the city always having to absorb those through the entertainment tax. So these tiers will escalate every year based on that 3% inflationary adjustment. So you can see in year by year 2027 the first tier starts at $11.3 million. The third tier starts at $16.9 million. So this just gives you an example of what could be earned based on these various tiers. So at a $10 million of total revenue, the max incentive the max management fee that could be paid is $125,000 total. At $13.5 million, which is consistent with what we've been averaging on good years, we pay about $217,500. On really getting to an even stronger year, $15 million, we're paying $262,000. And the kind of shooting for the moon, $17.5 million of revenue, we'd be paying upwards of $350,000, which is the cap. So that's the part where it caps out. The blended rate is essentially what it's saying, is telling you is this is the amount of our gross revenue that we're paying as part of a management fee. I can tell you historically, before COVID, we were probably ranging in the 1.3% area, so really in that kind of tier 1 area. This year, we're probably hovering in that 1.6 million, solid year in that kind of second tier as well. But we're also providing an incentive to stretch themselves even further. Can we achieve that? I think we can, but certainly it is a stretch goal to try to achieve that, and there's this incentive for additional compensation to help move that forward. The add-ons to this agreement also that weren't contemplated in previous agreement is there is a reduction factor. That means that we will reduce quantitative incentives that are earned below a net income of $900,000. So if you earn a net income less than $900,000, we will reduce the incentives dollar for dollar for whatever it reduces below that. What this does is it somewhat introduces the concept of incentivizing expense control. Now, I have full faith, and I know from working very closely with ASM Global that they really fastidiously monitor expenses because as a corporation and as a company, they monitor themselves and measure themselves and the ability to do that. And so I can tell you that they are already doing this, but this just kind of indoctrinates that into the agreement and gives us some protection on the downside. We don't want to incentivize that too far. And the reason why I say that is because we don't want to incentivize bad consequences such as we start pulling back on repairs and maintenance of the facility from the operating account because we want to make sure that our net profits are high enough. And that's why we lean more heavily on the revenue side in terms of the incentivizing rather than on the net profitability side. We also added what we call a revenue credit option. Now, this is not something that is going to happen on a regular basis, but there is on occasion, as we've had in the prior years, where, as you might listen to the CEO of Experience Sioux Falls, we're competing pretty vigorously against facilities across the nation to host some of these shows, and some of them have pretty significant economic impact. They might generate 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 room nights within our community. That helps the hospitality industry, but literally some communities are having to give away space in terms of rentals in order to accommodate or facilitate that, which we can be willing to do, but it plays against the incentives that we build into this agreement, which is based on revenue, right? So when we're incentivizing management based on revenue and you're giving away rooms, that those two incentives don't work very well together. So what we've developed is this idea of a revenue credit, which essentially says we're going to credit you conceptually as part of your incentive fee what you would have charged for those rooms on a reasonable basis, but you're forgoing because it's an important one. Now, this can only be done with administrative approval. It will be unique situations and only for particularly unique events that bring high economic impact to our community. So this is not something that's going to be regular, but it will provide an opportunity to reduce the idea that we, to limit the negative consequences on the incentivizing the management fee that we have when we're trying to go after things that are important to our community for a beneficial factor outside of just the event center campus. Lastly, before I entertain any questions, I'll just leave you with this statement. And the important thing as we structured this agreement is we are working to align ASM's contract and their incentives to align with the city and community interests overall. We believe that this restructured incentive compensation plan does that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have in regard to this agreement before we talk about the Ovations agreement.
Well, we covered a lot of ground there. Councilors, questions? Councilor Neitzer.
It's a big building, so what do we do in terms of inspections? You know, are we going through and doing annual inspections on the equipment? And then my other question is, how is the roof of the event center? There was a little bit of, I vaguely remember some question about it way back when we were looking at panels, so.
So one thing I would say is, so Scott Rust, our purchasing manager, works extremely closely with ASM Global, particularly the general manager, as well as Jeff Gortmaker, who's kind of handles the facilities themselves. So we work very closely in terms of planning for capital improvements, but also addressing any repair and maintenance items that come up over time. We've addressed, there's been a number of issues that have come up related to the HVAC that we've worked to address with them. Many people might be aware that we had issues with the ice maker for the ice, and so various Stampede games got delayed last year. We have the same issues at the Washington Pavilion, frankly, with their HVAC right now as well. But I would say Scott is probably out there every other week, probably touring, and then maybe you want to address this a little bit.
Good question, Counselor. The roof is in sound shape. I don't have any issues with the envelope of the building at all. Currently, the building's in great shape. One of the things that we did in this contract is that we did ask that all of the HVAC equipment, all of the mechanical equipment receive a PM maintenance program by a certified contractor. So we'll have contractors that are located either here in the city or in the region here coming through and providing preventive maintenance on all of that heavy-duty equipment. And the idea behind that was to prevent anything happening like we had happened this last year with the Simcoe ice unit over there, to prevent those things from happening, because supply chain is continuing to be a problem. So if we can get out ahead of it, it'll prevent any of that downtime.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question, which is not facility related, but it's booking related. So somebody back there will be. So I'm very excited to hear that, and I think it's a little bit unfair. Sometimes people say we only get country acts, and that's not true. But I know, myself, my wife, lots of people I know would like to see more other concerts. That being said, I do wonder, how do some of those other acts do? Because when I just kind of look at like a Ticketmaster or look at those and see, when we get some of these other poppy rock acts, things like that, are we selling like half the building? Do we struggle in this city to book some of those, or to get, good returns on some of these? Because I kind of have that inkling when I look at some of them. Maybe I'm wrong.
So I'm going to let, I failed to mention that Mike Cruson, who is the general manager for ASM Global for our facility, is here. I'm going to let him address that question.
I like the classic rock acts. I go to Def Leppard anytime they come, and those are always sold out. That's not a problem, but I'm talking more of the contemporary stuff, to some of the other things, or the heavy metal. How do those do?
They do pretty well, actually. Had Iron Maiden concert last night. Set new records for merchandise sales, actually, for the facility. Typically those concerts are doing anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 to 8,000. It really depends on the act. As far as diversity, we just had Backstreet Boys a couple weeks ago, which was obviously pop, and had over 9,000 people. So there is a perception that we constantly fight in this market because country does so well, classic rock does so well, to try to get those pop acts in. We are going against, as Sean mentioned, against bigger markets in our neighborhood. So it's the cities, Omaha, Lincoln, much bigger populations, much, I would say, more diverse as far as college crowds and age groups, that it's an easier sell for a lot of promoters to go ahead and book those spaces. And some of those buildings are bigger as well, so they don't have to charge as high of a ticket price, those type of things. So it is something that we constantly battle. My team is constantly working on that. And again, it goes back to what Sean had said before. The way we treat our artists, we treat our Live Nation reps and those type of things does make hay in those conversations. Coming out of the pandemic, as we'd mentioned before, there are less dates. Acts are touring, they're on tour, but they're taking, maybe they did 50 before, they're only doing 30 or 35 now. So we're up against a numbers game as well. But that doesn't mean that we give up or like that. We still constantly work. Sometimes we have to restructure deals and stuff like that because we know it's important to the city and we know it's important to the community to try to have that diverse action.
Very good. Good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Counselor Selberg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like with the new Rapid City Arena coming, is there chances to, I don't know if team up is the right word, but work with them to maybe attract an act where if they're coming up this way anyway? I always think of that sometimes with Fargo Dome. It seems like sometimes we're having the same show or they seem in the same area, or I don't know.
I'll try to address that, and Mike, you can give me the nod if I didn't address it appropriately. I think maybe some, but probably not as much as one might expect, primarily because we're looking at, we're going to tend to attract, and hopefully the Rapid City folks don't hate this, but we tend to get bigger acts in Sioux Falls because of the larger density of population that we might have here, as well as our routing opportunities between Omaha, Fargo, Minneapolis, Des Moines. We have some close proximity with some of those larger urban communities that might make routing more appropriate than heading out west to hit Rapid City and then maybe shooting off into Denver or some of those other areas. So we do benefit from our location in terms of routing, fair to say? So.
And I don't know, it's probably an oversimplified question. So are there acts out there, like if there's a big act that, I mean, we've had Elton John here, we've had some obviously big names in country in that too, but is there ever certain acts where it's like, they don't even entertain the idea of maybe coming, or I mean, if they were going to, you just, the seating isn't enough, or there's not a revenue enough, or there's just no way we get shot down very often in that realm?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we're struggling a little bit with this kind of lean towards stadium shows, which is going to generate a lot more revenues for some of these acts, particularly coming off of 2 years of not touring absolutely at all. So, you know, when you're selling out a stadium, you're going to make a lot more revenue than you maybe are going to be if you're coming to Sioux Falls and selling out the Premier Center for, you know, 11 or 12,000 seats total max capacity. So that trend in the industry, I think, is a little concerning because it is taking some of those top tier acts and moving them to stadiums. I've personally been to a stadium act and not a fan. So I'm hoping that people will, you know, kind of acclimate back to the smaller venues because it's just a much better place to see a concert or entertainment. And so we do have, you know, where we have to compete. You do lose some of that. I think the bigger issues in many respects is that they're doing fewer dates. And, you know, they're making up their pre-COVID commitments, and then they're doing fewer dates, smaller tours. And you also have to remember with pop and some of these iconic acts, they're going overseas where country typically is not going overseas as much. So you're not just competing within our national market, we're competing against overseas markets as well in terms of trying to book some of these acts. So that's why we're trying to promote some of these incentives within this agreement in terms of, you know, booking those top 30 acts and incentivizing them to come from a management perspective to get. On the other side, we're also providing sometimes monetary incentives or having to discount rentals or things of that nature to try to bring some of these acts that we may not always get to come to Sioux Falls, as opposed to those that we would regularly get here locally. Right. The one thing I would say is when we went through this annual review process this last year, which we did about a month and a half ago, I took an opportunity to just do a survey, and I was looking at all the other facilities that I could compare ourselves to in terms of a competitor, and how many acts did they have booked in the outgoing. And, you know, I looked at places like, you know, Rapid City and as well as Sioux City, which not really too competitive at this point, just based on size and what, you know, in terms of what they're able to capable of booking, versus Des Moines, Minneapolis Target Center, Xcel Energy Center, CHS down in Omaha, as well as the facility down in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the one thing that I think I was pleasantly surprised at, because I think Mike would attest to that I ride pretty hard on who we book and how much we have booked and what type of acts we're booking, and we talk about it every month, and I'm sure he's tired of hearing me talk about it. But when I looked and surveyed the other facilities, one thing I was surprising to me is how many acts we have booked here compared to those facilities. Now, Xcel it has, you know, they have the Wild, so they struggle to book. They can't book during that time period, and you have the Target Center with the NBA and Timberwolves, so they can't book during that and the Lynx. But as far as how we're performing against our competitors, we're doing an excellent job, especially in terms of when you look at the volume of shows that we're producing and bringing in here. The only one that's probably even remotely close, Xcel Energy Center does a great job of those big name acts, but maybe not quite as many shows as we put on here. CHS down in Omaha is certainly a top performer, but I would say we're even performing better than Des Moines when we look at how we're performing. And I think that has a lot to do with the team that we have managing the facility.
Right. Interesting. Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Starr?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. take me through a little bit of the capital budget of what we expect to invest. It kind of follows a little bit on what Councilor Neitzer was talking about, but how do we market the rest of the facility? I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the Denny itself, but the entertainment center, the arena, and how we continue to bring things that are that way. Because when you look at the budget, or at least my quick scan of it, we're not making a lot of capital investments at this point.
So I think that's fair to say relative to the event center, because I mean, we've made some improvements, but we had a newer facility. What you will see is we were really heavy on the convention center. There have been some mammoth projects that have been completed there. Now you're going to see that start to tail off, and what you're going to see is it's going to start picking up in the event center because it's hitting that time period where we need to start refreshing some of that. I'll let Scott talk a little bit just on what's planned as well as what we've accomplished so far.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, the convention center, again, the envelope of that building has totally been gone through and remodeled. So we're in good shape there. Now we're focused more on the interior of that building. And so you're starting to see lights and HVAC equipment that are starting to get replaced, doors, windows, all those fun things that, you know, they're really not sexy projects to talk about, but they need to be done. And so that is going to go on. Into the next couple of years you'll start to see more lighting. We're just finishing up with that actually, and then more heavy HVAC work. And some of that is going on right now. And we'll push into that for the next few years. The Premier Center, a little bit different deal there. You know, we're still, you know, the equipment's not very old. Haven't had to do much heavy maintenance there. However, you know, our Daktronics equipment is aging. And, you know, that has roughly a 10 to 12 year life. So you'll start to see a few of those displays start to age out and get replaced. And we're budgeting for those. And in a few more years, you'll start to see the center hung and ribbon board get replaced. So a lot of technology type stuff. You know, that building is wired. We call it's a wired building. So it does take a lot of maintenance in that aspect on the IT side. And so there's been some pretty good projects there too. So to keep it up to date, because those pieces of equipment obviously in the last 5 years. The arena, well, that's another story. And again, we've had that discussion, and again, that's being further studied. And right now there is not a lot planned in that building at all. So it's really just a maintain as is. And currently there aren't any issues over there that we're aware of.
So then the stadium kind of falls into that category as well until we make some final decisions.
Right. Yeah, I would say the stadium and the arena are kind of at a steady state, if you want to say it that way. There are some smaller projects that are being done. Obviously, we have to take care of the facility if we have any liability issues or anything like that do need to be done. You know, things that we need to, you know, we're doing some few things for playability that need to be done there to, you know, attract you know, better players and so forth. So we've made some improvements into the field and so forth there. So, but yeah, small stuff at the stadium and the arena mainly though, mainly R&M type projects.
Thank you.
Councilor McCarris?
Director, what role does ASM play on the kind of campus task study group that's going on right now?
So they've been actively involved in that. So they certainly attend and participate as part of the conversation. They're not a member of it per se, but we certainly rely upon their expertise in the industry. Give you an example, we have one of their national ASM people will be coming through in December. I was just talking to Mike about that, and we'll be asking this individual to give us some perspective on things they're seeing for development, ideas that they're seeing elsewhere that has worked in other communities relative to facilities, because ASM Global has facilities throughout the United States, and those that are kind of traveling from facility to facility get kind of an idea of what works and what doesn't work, particularly for our area because it is unique. I don't want to say it's an island, but it sits, you know, in its own distinct area, separate from downtown or the Sanford Sports Complex or some of the retail areas in Louise and so forth. So being in that kind of distinct area, what opportunities have you seen, ways that has been developed in other communities? So they've been very actively engaged as part of those conversations.
And one final question, is there anything that in those conversations that would cause this agreement to be opened back up and renegotiated? For example, the arena gets turned into a, I don't know, ping pong place or something like that.
Yeah, so essentially what the agreement states is that, you know, if we lose the arena or we take the arena down, that we hold it somewhat constant within, in terms of our compensation structure. Whether we can do that without reopening the agreement or have to reopen the agreement will, I guess, depend on what kind of happens with that campus overall. So you can only craft an agreement based on what you can conceptualize at this point, and not knowing where we're going to be and when we're going to be there in terms of that campus, we build it for what maximizing the opportunities we have in the current assets.
Thank you. Let's move on. And before we do that, I'm just going to remind the council we do have executive session tonight. So
this is going to be a quicker presentation here. Fewer modifications related to the Ovations agreement, who provide food and beverage services. I will note that Chad Stoner, who has been with us for many years and is regional district manager, is also present here on behalf of Ovations, OVG, and Spectra. Just to give you a little bit on the history there, they have provided food and beverage services at our convention center since 2007. They provide all food beverage services at the event center complex, arena, convention center, and premier center. We last renewed with them back in 2018. In 2019, we removed the Orpheum, similar to what we did with ASM Global when Washington Pavilion took over. And as I noted previously, ASM Global serves as the contract administrator on behalf of the city once the contract and agreement is executed. However, we still keep very close communication with Ovations, who we meet monthly as well on a direct basis. Just to give you a few highlights. So in terms of total revenue over the last 5 years, they've had over $33 million in sales. That's generated over $13.3 million in commissions to the city of Sioux Falls, which is run through ASM Global. So they manage all of that, and then that appears on the books for the entire campus in one comprehensive combined set of books. Some of the highlights, I think one of the more important things that they accomplished, particularly during COVID, is updating their cash operations and going to a cashless system in terms of touchless transactions. They've been able to cut down the average time by 26 seconds, which is really important. It's about keeping lines moving more quickly, providing better service, and frankly, selling more stuff if you can move people through more quickly, which only, to a great extent, benefits not only the consumer, but benefits the city in terms of what we're able to accomplish there. And that's based on an annual technology investment that Ovations has made of $120,000 annually. I would be remiss if not also speaking to the community engagement component of this. I know I didn't speak to this with ASM Global, but they certainly have been promoting a lot of being engaged with the community and volunteer time off, and as well as starting things like Grouchmas that help our local charities and nonprofits. A great thing that Ovations is able to do is they work with nonprofits who come in and serve during some of these big events at the Premier Center and so forth, and then they're able to earn money towards either their kids' clubs and so forth. So this just gives you a couple ideas of some of the groups and the local youth organizations that they've worked with over the last several years. In terms of total revenue history, you can see pre-COVID, we were hovering about $9 million in total revenues being generated from food and beverage from the combined facilities, which was generating upwards of $3.4 to $3.5 million in commissions. You can see that in 2020, obviously we took a significant hit relative to COVID. Again, similar to what we saw with the rest of the facility, we have a build back year in 2021, and I am hopeful, Chad, you can nod, that we will be back at 2019, 2018 in 2022. And so we're getting back to those pre-pandemic times, and I know they've, certainly we have to understand too that there's been cost escalations and all of that with that, but getting back to those pre-pandemic numbers has been really a success story for us. Some of the substantive changes relative to this Ovations agreement, obviously we've updated the name from Spectra to Ovations, dropped the reference to the Orpheum, as well as the Sioux Falls Stadium. We have updated the insurance provision, similar to what we did with ASM Global. We do have a capital contribution from Ovations. In their previous agreement, they contributed $300,000. In this agreement, they will be contributing over $600,000 over the first several years of this agreement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those capital contributions are going to be used to support. One of the things that we did provide as part of this agreement, as we recognize the state of our industry, we have a very tight labor market, and they are not immune to that. Wanting to have consistent and quality service is important, particularly for non-tipped people that are working in the catering side for the facility. And so with that, we did allow for them to reduce. They have what they call a management charge, which is a 22% charge on the provision of food and services. That's on top of just the generic food costs for which we receive a commission. We've agreed to exclude that from commissions. with the intent that those funds would be directly utilized to boost wages for those catering and non-tipped employees at the facility. We were able to do that based on that understanding, as well as the idea that they're doubling their capital contribution as part of our new agreement with Ovations over the next 5 years. This just shows the commission structure that we have. It varies based on the type of food being provided and at what facility it's being provided at. Many of them are tiered, so as we do more, as we achieve a higher tier in terms of the revenues, we achieve higher commissions overall. These commissions remain unchanged. The tiers are not changed. So this is identical to what was in the previous agreement. In terms of the $600,000 capital infrastructure or the capital contribution that they're going to be making over the next several years, $300,000 of it is going to be dedicated to refreshing concession stands, particularly within the Premier Center. So this gives you an idea of what one refreshed stand might look like. I can't guarantee that this is exactly what it will be, but this kind of concepts out kind of a Tex-Mex kind of idea. People are looking for more food options when they're coming to events and higher end food options, not just getting a hot dog or fried foods, but sometimes healthier options and also a variety of foods. So this is one of those ideas that has been generated and would be supported by that capital contribution. Another is this idea of higher end mixed drinks that people are kind of demanding, and so repurposing one of the concessions to be able to support that with cold beer for those floor seated patrons. We would be investing $100,000 into refreshing some of the beer garden. You can see the difference between the left and the right and kind of just upgrading those. If you've been to some other venues, you also see mobile beer coolers is becoming kind of a new thing where you can just grab and go, swipe, and you get back to your seat more quickly if you're just grabbing a beer. And so again, you're trying to provide a fast experience for the customers so they can get back to the concert. We're also looking to $100,000 for upgrading the mobile bars, so you might see those in the vet concourse and so forth that are utilized. So something just a little bit nicer experience, quality, and upgraded experience. And all that matters in terms of what you're branding and what the customers see when they come to our facility. And then lastly, $100,000 would be invested into small wares and silverware. These would be just the small items that they use for catering and so forth that just provide an upgraded experience overall. Lastly, I'd say this, the importance as we looked at this contract is we really wanted to make sure that we continue to improve, refresh our food and beverage experience. It's important for us to keep up with changes in the industry and food concepts, adjust to customer expectations in the market, and continue to provide that first-class experience overall that people have come to expect. And with that, I'll answer any questions you have on this particular agreement.
Questions, council? Seeing none, I'll just make one comment. I'm not a big fan of the cashless only service. I do carry cash. I'm probably one of the very few that still do that, but not a big fan. But I appreciate all the work. I appreciate all the work the finance team has done to put this together and look forward to another long, prosperous contract with you people. That being that, we'll move on now to public comment. Anybody has any public comment to deal with the two contracts that we discussed? Now's the time. Seeing none, Council Selberg.
Mr. Chair, I'd make a motion to enter into executive session for the purpose of consulting with legal counsel or reviewing communications from legal counsel about proposed or pending litigation or contractual matters pursuant to SDCL 1-25-23.
Second, Neitzer.
Been moved and seconded. Can we get a vote, please?
Council members Barranco?
Yes.
Cole?
Yes.
McCorris?
Yes.
Neitzer?
Yes.
Selberg?
Yes.
Sale?
Yes.
Starr?
Yes.
That passed 7-0. We'll move into executive session. Please clear the room. Thank you very much.